All right, let's get going here. So last time we talked about short-term solvency, long-term solvency measures. What's the difference between short-term and long-term? Yeah, time. So what's the breakover point? Yeah, 1 year. And so short-term measures, suppliers are going to be interested in that. Anyone loaning you money on the short-term? Who's interested in your long-term solvency? Say again? Who does that live?
Like banks and people loaning you money.
Banks, bondholders, people are loaning you money on a longer term. So those are who are going to be interested in the long-term solvency measures. And then we talked about the asset management measures. I don't think we got quite to who cares about those, but for one of them was internal analysis, and that's where we would look at our own performance. And that's where I used to see these all the time when I was running a business. My accountant would produce those, and then we'd have long talks about how I was falling short, right? And then you'll have external analysis would be like you'd have competitors looking at it. You would also have equity analysts that might be looking at those sorts of things. In fact, you'll hear people, in fact, just in the last few weeks, we hear a lot about inventory at retail. Inventory turnover is down. Does anyone know why?
Supply chain.
The supply chain, very good. So the supply chain stunk. And during the COVID thing, everybody wanted to buy certain things. And the supply chain, instead of like ships stacked up out in the ocean just waiting to dock. And so what does everyone do? They order way more than they need. And guess what? Suddenly all the ships dock, all that crap shows up at the store, and you guys are done buying exercise equipment and webcams and all that stuff, and now they've got it coming out their ears. And so there's a couple of ways that they're getting rid of that. Number one, discounts at their own stores. What's the downside for that? Yeah, it cuts profitability. Number two, selling that stuff to liquidators. Same downside, right? And also, if you continue to sell these goods and you liquidated part of them, people can go out to Overstocks and buy it for 20. Why are they going to buy it from you for 40? Does that make sense? Okay, so those are the kinds of things that we see equity analysts looking at. Okay, now let's talk about profitability measures. And the first one we're going to talk about is profit margin, and that is NI. What does NI stand for? Yeah, it's net income divided by sales. And you can think of this as the number of cents that you make in profit for every dollar of sales. Now, there are two ways that you can raise your profit margin here. We can either make net income larger, or we could make sales smaller. Which would you recommend? By the way, what's good? Higher profit margin or lower? Yeah, we tend to say higher is better, right? So, do I want to cut my sales? No. Now, we recently saw the automakers have to do this because they only had so many chips, semiconductors, that they could put in cars. And so what did they do? Do you think they kept cranking out the cheap cars? No. So the profit margin is much better on SUVs and luxury cars, and so automakers would focus on putting the chips into those cars as opposed to these low-end ones. In that case, they were able to improve the profit margin. But if they had had an unlimited supply of chips, they would have gone ahead and made all those cars and thus had greater sales and perhaps a slightly lower profit margin. Now, so decreasing sales is not the answer, so increasing net income has to be. Now, what is net income? It starts at the very top with your sales, and so that's the price times the number of units, and then we're subtracting out costs. So, what should we be doing? We could increase the price, right? All else equal, that would increase our net income. What's the problem?
People won't buy it at a higher price.
Yeah, people won't buy it at a higher price. And so the number that you sell goes down, and you could hurt yourself. Now, there may be a point at which it's good to raise your price a little bit, and it lowers the units by a little bit, and you actually end up making more money there. So there is an optimum. But typically, we're just not going to try to crank up the price to increase our profit margin. So what does that leave for us? If we can't crank up the price, what do we have to do?
Increase cost.
Yeah, you got to decrease costs. Now, we've talked previously about the kinds of costs that we want to get rid of. And the kind that we want to get rid of is the non-value added costs. So we talked about Hershey's getting rid of the cocoa butter was a mistake. And substituting horse meat for beef was a mistake, right? But there are some costs that we can get rid of that our customers don't care about. I'll give an example. Anybody here ever changed the spark plugs in their car?
I have a husband for
You have a husband for that sort of thing? Yeah, good for you. You have? Okay. When you bought the spark plugs, did they come in a big box, like big package that contained all the spark plugs? Yeah. How many cylinders in your engine? 8. Woo! She's a V8 gal. Okay. Straight into very rare, right? Okay, so she gets 8 spark plugs and they're in this big package. Now, once you opened up that package, what happened with each individual spark plug?
They just fell out.
Oh, they just fell out, okay. Well, so good spark plugs are packaged individually. In fact, one time my dad used one of those little individual spark plug boxes to make a splint for my cat that broke its leg. Kind of fun. Not the breaking of the leg, the splint. So, my point is that there is all this packaging. Now, you may feel special when you're undoing all this packaging as a person changing your own spark plugs. But if you were building tons and tons of cars, would all that packaging bring you extra value? No, in fact, it's going to bring you the opposite of extra value. So what could you do? You could come up with some sort of reusable packaging, like a tray that the spark plug sat in, that would be easy for the assembly workers to pull out and put in. And so those are the kinds of non-value added things that we want to get rid of to bring down our costs. Always good to get rid of those kinds of costs. And so that's how I would tell you to bring up your profit margin, is to get rid of costs that don't bring value to your customer. Now, what about your EBITDA margin? Anyone know what EBITDA means?
Earnings before interest, taxes, amortization, and depreciation.
Oh, very good. He's on fire. Okay, so now let's talk about pronunciation here. If I say EBITDA, someone undoubtedly corrects me and says it's pronounced how? Oh, EBITDA. If I say EBIT, they say EBIT. And if I say EBIT, they say EBIT. Right? Whatever. Whatever floats your boat, right? Just find out how your boss pronounces it and follow suit. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And so if we think of the firm, what might differentiate firms other than their operations? Well, how about the amount of debt that they have? You could have 2 identical firms financed in different ways. One that was 100% equity would have no interest payments whatsoever, and one that was 50% debt funded would have lots of interest payments. So that's the first difference. Don't worry about taxes, but let's talk about depreciation and amortization. By the way, amortization is very similar to depreciation. It's just for forest, oil wells, mines, that sort of stuff. But both of those things are non-cash expenses, and they both have to do with the age of your assets. When I got my first business that I was running in 1997, every single one of my machines was fully depreciated out. And so I had no depreciation expense whatsoever. But the operation right next to me had some brand new machines, so they had depreciation. If we were looking purely at net income, I would have looked better simply because I didn't have the depreciation to subtract that to bring down my net income. Does that make sense? And so if I want to look at how the operations are truly performing, I'm going to look at this EBITDA margin. It gives us a better idea of how good your operations are performing, stripped out with all the age of your assets and your capital structure. By the way, what do we say capital structure is? What was the definition of capital structure?
A we fund a business, how much flow, how much cash.
Yeah, so how we fund the business, how much debt and how much equity, right? Proportions of debt and equity in our capital structure. Okay, so that's just like profit margin, only on an operational level. So it's sort of an operational profit margin. And then we have return on assets, which is pretty easy. It's just net income divided by total assets. You can think of this as how we are using the assets of the firm to produce profit. And what do you think would be better there, higher or lower?
Higher.
Yeah, generally higher we're looking for. Now, we said that the goal of financial management is to do what? Yeah, maximize shareholder wealth. And so it's nice to know what we're doing with our assets, but what we might be more concerned about is the return on equity, which is the money invested by those very shareholders. And so what we're going to do is take net income and divide it by total equity. Now, knowing that total assets is equal to total debt plus total equity, if the firm has any debt whatsoever, what's going to be true about the relationship between ROE and ROA? Let's ask this question. What if the firm has no debt whatsoever? What's the relationship between those two? Yeah, they're going to be the same, right? If there's no debt whatsoever, they're going to be the same. But as we start to add debt, you're going to see ROE pull away from ROA. And so you start to get this warm feeling that perhaps you could just take on a boatload of debt, blow that ROE up. And we'll talk about why that's not necessarily a great idea. So who cares about these things? Well, we use them for internal measures for one. And then, of course, the equity analysts and your competitors are going to be looking at these things. By the way, remember my example about Americhem and Poly 1. Do you think that our profit margin was ever going to be as high as theirs? No, our cost of goods sold was higher because we bought such lower quantities that we paid more for each pound of raw material. And so even though we knew we could never hit their profit margin, if we were only at 1/3 or 1/2 of their profit margin, maybe we should start looking at what we're doing wrong. Okay, questions? Now let's talk about market value measures. And the first one is earnings per share. And anytime you hear accountants talk about earnings, they are talking about net income. Anytime you hear accountants talk about earnings, they are talking about net income. And so all we're going to do here is take net income divided by shares outstanding. Where am I going to find the net income for the firm? Which financial statement? Yeah, the income statement, right? That was just way too easy. Where are we going to find the shares outstanding for the firm? Say again? Yeah, sometimes it's a note on the balance sheet down at the bottom, footnote. It's always going to be mentioned somewhere in the annual report. And you could also go to Yahoo Finance or Google Finance, if there is such a thing. You can look it up online, right? So that's where you get that number. Now, the next question is this. What's better, higher EPS or lower EPS?
Higher.
It depends. Let's talk about this. I have two identical firms. One has 10,000 shares outstanding and one has 100,000 shares outstanding. The firm with 10,000 shares outstanding has an EPS that's 10 times higher. Is that necessarily better? No, it's just like cutting the pizza in more slices, right? And so your instinct is correct if we are looking at the same company over time, assuming they keep the same number of shares. Does that make sense? Because that just means net income's going up. But we cannot use this, if I just say EPS is $1.36, the only thing you can tell me from that is that the net income at the firm is positive. That's the only thing you can tell me because you don't know how many shares are outstanding. When does EPS become important? Well, it has to do with these equity analysts and with reporting. So once every quarter, the company has to report its financials, among which the most interesting one is the earnings. How much money are they making? And you'll see these analysts will post their expectations. And if their expectations average out to be $1.45, and we only announce $1.36, is that good news or bad news? Bad news, right? But if the analysts on average are expecting $1.25 and we announce $1.36, what's going to happen to the share price that day? It's going to go up, right? And so it's all about expectation. And once again, over time, we would hope that that number goes up, assuming the number of shares stays the same. Now, what about price to earnings ratio? Well, we just talked about the bottom part, EPS. The top is price per share. Where in the world am I going to find the price per share?
Yahoo Finance.
Yahoo Finance. And what would it be another name for price per share?
Stock price?
Yeah, it's just the stock price, right? That's just the stock price. And so what we're going to do is take the stock price and divide it by earnings per share. Now, PE ratios vary by industry. So I'll give you some examples here. If we're looking at electric utilities, the PE might be somewhere between 7 and 10. On the S&P 500, which is like almost everything, it's like roughly in the teens. And then if you have some very, very new, exciting companies, it'll be maybe 30 or 35, who knows? What's the difference? The way to think about this is how much are people willing to pay for $1 of current earnings? People would only be willing to pay more for $1 of current earnings if they thought earnings were going to grow faster. And so faster growth means higher PE. Faster growth means higher PE. I have these Chinese EMBA students that come over, and they're always excited to learn about stocks. And they ask me, should I buy low PE stocks? And I say, yes. And they're happy. And they say, wait a minute, should I buy high PE stocks? And I say, yes. Now they're really confused. They say, well, should I buy middle PE stocks? And I say, yes. As we are going to learn in chapter 11, the answer is buy them all. Right? We're going to hold a diversified portfolio. PE ratios are useful when comparing between firms in the same industry. Let me say that again. PE ratios are useful when comparing between firms in the same industry. If a PE of, let's say, Walmart versus Costco. Costco's got a higher PE than Walmart. That means that basically people think Costco's got more growth opportunities, maybe they're executing better. All sorts of reasons they might have a higher PE ratio, but in that case, a higher PE is better. Now let's talk about the market to book ratio. That is the market value per share. Ms. Nuachwanda, where do you think we would get the market value per share? Any idea where to get that information? Maybe we've already talked about it today. Ms. Marina.
Shahu.
Second.
Shahu. I don't know how to pronounce it in English. Shahu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that Spanish?
Shahu.
Okay, does anyone speak Spanish?
Argentinian accent is a little different.
Okay, well my Spanish so far all I can ask for you is ayúdame por favor. That's helped me, please, I think. Okay, let me ask someone else. Mr. Bowrichter, where would I get market value per share?
Isn't it just stock price?
It's just the stock price. It's just the stock price. And then we're going to divide that by book value per share. Now, book value per share, let me expand that for you. It is the book value of the equity per share. It is the book value of the equity per share. Now, how am I going to find that? Well, we know that on the balance sheet, we have the assets on this side, and then we have the liabilities and the owner's equity. So all I have to do to find out this owner's equity is to take assets and minus liabilities. However, there may be some preferred shares or something, and so we're not going to include that. We're going to include everything involving common shares. So that's going to be our owner's equity. I'm going to then divide that number by the number of shares outstanding. I'm going to divide that number by the number of shares outstanding, and that's going to give me the book value per share. Now, the book value per share, keep in mind, book value is the historical cost of the asset minus any depreciation that's going on. In a healthy company, do you think the market to book ratio would be greater than 1 or less than 1? Remember, my operation had no book value because everything had been totally depreciated out. And so my market value was still positive. My book value was 0. Does that, you start to figure out here that the book value typically, in fact, in a healthy company, the book value will always be lower. In fact, this is the way Warren Buffett says to think about it. You guys know Warren Buffett? I'm not a big fan, but he says something right at least twice a day, kind of like a broken clock. Do you know broken clocks right twice a day? Okay, back to the story, except it's digital. Okay, so what does Warren Buffett say? He says that buying a share that has market to book less than 1 is like giving the managers $1 and asking for something less in return. Buying a stock with market to book less than 1 is like giving the managers $1 and asking for something less in return. If that is your life dream, please bring all your dollars to my office and I'll help you out, right? You can give me all your dollars, I'll give you something less in return, we can both leave happy. Now, here's the fun thing. Do you think Warren Buffett could actually get by with buying a firm that had market to book less than 1 and still come out on top? Yeah, how can he do it? Mr. Fisher, what do you think? What can Warren Buffett do that you can't do?
He's got a lot of capital behind him.
He's got a lot of capital behind him, which means he can buy the whole firm. That's step number 1. Buy the whole firm. Step number 2, why do you think the market to book is less than 1? Most likely, the managers suck. If you buy all the shares, what can you do with the managers? Fire them. Now, the next question is this. Who do you replace them with? Do you think Warren just like randomly pulls people off the street? You think he might know some folks? Yeah, he might have some smart, trusted friends that he'd be willing to stick in there. And so Warren Buffett can buy these firms, market to book less than 1, and turn them into something much more valuable. You can't do that. So I don't recommend it. In fact, these books that say, investing the Warren Buffett way, whenever I see one of these, I always open it up. And if the first page doesn't say, get a boatload of money, then I shut it because I know they have no clue what they're talking about, because a lot of Warren's magic is his ability to buy firms and make changes, or to buy private companies that the owners don't recognize are undervalued by the money that he's throwing at them. Okay. Let's see, market capitalization, easy peasy. It's just the price per share times the number of shares outstanding. We've already talked about where to get that. That is the market value of the equity for the overall firm. The market capitalization is the market value of the equity for the overall firm. Now, keep in mind, it's just the equity, though. The true value of the firm, the assets, it's equal to total debt plus total equity. And so if you have a firm that is all equity here, it will have a higher market capitalization than a identical firm that is half debt and half equity. Does that make sense? So market capitalization is kind of a fun thing to talk about. We talk about Apple having a market capitalization of $1 trillion, but that's not the true value of Apple's operations. And so if we want to find out what their operations are worth, we look at what's called the enterprise value. We look at the enterprise value. We start out with our market capitalization, which we just calculated. That's the market value of the equity. We add the market value of the interest-bearing debt. What kinds of debts do we have that don't bear interest? How about accounts payable, right? That's not interest-bearing debt. So we'd be looking at things like bonds, notes, bank loans, would be the interest-bearing debt. Now we're going to add that, so now we have debt plus equity. Now we are going to also subtract out the cash. We're going to subtract out the cash because the market capitalization includes the cash at the firm. Can firms hold on to too much cash? Yeah. Apple's market capitalization is inflated because they sit on too much cash. If we want to look at the value of the operations themselves, then we have to subtract out that cash. And so the enterprise value is just the market value of the equity plus the market value of the interest-bearing debt, and then we're going to subtract out the cash. Now, why do we do that? It's going to give us something similar to PE, but on an operational perspective instead of a purely financial perspective. And that is, we're going to take that enterprise value that we just calculated, divide by EBITDA. What do we say EBITDA was? It's a measure, it's an operating measure of profit, right? It is not impacted by the age of the assets, it's not impacted by the capital structure. And so if we do that, we're going to come up with something very similar to PE ratio, only on an operational standpoint. And so it's a way of purely distilling the growth opportunities, perhaps, of the enterprise itself. So once again, amongst identical firms or firms in the same industry, a higher EV multiple, just like PE, will be better than a lower one. A higher EV multiple will be better than a lower one. Questions? Okay, now let's talk about ratio comparisons. So far, it all sounds super easy, but I've made this point a couple of times, and that is that we can only compare ratios between companies in the same industry. For example, in the software industry, anybody have any idea what the profit margins look like?
Very high.
They're high, like 65% high, right? That's pretty sweet. Now, bless you. What do you think about the profit margin on groceries? It's low. It's like 2-3% on a good day. And so what we end up seeing is that if we just compared profit margins, we would say, oh, these people at the grocery store stink, right? You have to look at other firms in the same industry in order to make comparisons. Now, how do grocery stores make up for this excruciatingly low profit margin? What do they do with their inventory? They have to turn it really fast, right? So they get really high inventory turns. And so if you sell a bunch of stuff at 2%, maybe you make as much money as if you sold less stuff at 10%. Does that make sense? By the way, do you want the inventory to turn quickly on the grocery store shelves? Yes, why? Yeah, stuff expires, stuff goes bad. Every time I go to Price Cutter and I pick something up, I'm like, wow, that looks good. What's the first thing I do? Yeah, people at Walmart are pretty good about rotating their stock. Price Cutter depends on the store, so buyer beware. I'm sure there are Walmarts where they don't pay attention either. Okay, now, so that's between different industries, you got to be careful. And even in the same industry with different strategies. I'm going to give you 2 examples here. Number 1 is Home Depot, and number 2 is Ace Hardware. Are they ostensibly in the same industry? Yeah, they're both selling basically the same kind of stuff. But is their strategy different? Yeah, so Home Depot, first of all, Home Depot is not carrying near the breadth of weird little stuff that Ace Hardware will. Now, Ace may only have 2 of them on the shelf, but they're carrying weird little stuff. At Home Depot, they're going to carry stuff that turns more frequently and stuff that they can buy in higher quantities so they can get better economies of scale. And let's talk about the labor. If you walk into Ace Hardware, in fact, it used to be Ace is the place with the helpful hardware man, right? But then we started letting women sell hardware. And so now it's Ace is a helpful place or something like that, right? And it's perfectly fine for women to sell hardware. Not sexist. Back to the story. So you walk in I'll tell you a true story here. My wife and I bought this house locally, and it had these Japanese toilets called Toto, and named after the dog from Wizard of Oz for whatever reason. And then it wasn't too long, maybe a few years later, my toilet starts making this noise. And it was making that noise. And I'm like, what the hell? And so I kind of narrow it down. I'm pretty sure it's that flapper thing that lets the water out of the tank. And so I go to Home Depot, and I'm looking at the flappers, and none of them look like mine. And there's this young Home Depot guy, probably 18 maybe, and he smells like weed. And he walks up and he says, "Hey man, can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm looking for a flapper for my toilet." I said, "This one says it's universal, but it doesn't quite look right." He says, "Of course it'll work, man, it's universal." He must have just smoked, right? Okay. I'm like, do you think I'm gonna trust this guy? No. So get in the car, I drive down the highway, I go to Ace Hardware. And I walk in, and my foot has not even crossed the threshold before someone says, "Welcome to Ace, can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got an issue with my toilet." And the guy says, "What's going on?" I said, "It's making this noise." He says, "Is it a Toto?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Has your wife been putting those chlorine tablets in the tank?" Because he knew it wasn't me, right? I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, unlike other flappers, the flappers in Totos are not resistant to those chemicals. And what happens is they get attacked and they grow brittle over time, and then they start to leak by and they make that noise you just described." Do you think this guy knows what he's talking about? Yeah! Do you know why he knows what he's talking about?
Trained correctly.
He was a plumber! Right? I could tell by, you guys know about plumbers? Yeah. He's a plumber, right? And I said, "Would you happen to have this flapper?" He says, "Follow me." And I follow him back. By the way, the aisles at Ace are very skinny. They're trying to fit absolutely as many different SKUs, shopkeeping units, in the same store as possible, right? And so we go back, and finally we get to this wall of flappers, and there it is! Only in a deeper blue than mine, because mine was chemically damaged, right? And he says, "Whoop, there you go." What do you think the labor costs look like at Ace versus Home Depot? Yeah, probably higher, because by the way, plumbers, if you can't afford to send your kids to college, send them to plumbing school, right? Just tell them to wear suspenders.
Trucking school's cheaper.
What's that?
Trucking school's cheaper.
Trekking school is cheaper.
And you have less meals.
Yes, but you're more likely to die of coronary problems. Oh yeah. Oh hey, I'm related to tons of truckers. They tend to just, well anyway, back to the story. Yeah. Okay, so you're right, trucking school is cheaper, but you'll live longer and you'll make more money as a plumber. Back to, by the way, do you think truck drivers can be replaced with automation? Yeah. Do you think plumbers can be replaced with automation? No. Another thing to keep in mind. Okay, back to the story. She's always giving me grief. Back to the story. What do you think about inventory turns? What do you think the inventory turns look like at Ace versus Home Depot? They got to be a lot lower. Now, I'll bet the profit margin is higher at Ace. Kind of has to be, or they couldn't put up with these low inventory turns. Do you think I paid a premium to get the flapper that I wanted when I wanted it? Absolutely. Do you think I paid a premium to be able to talk to someone who wasn't high? Absolutely. Now, how many of you actually work at Home Depot or Lowe's? Okay. You know, anyone that does, I'm sure you're not the guy I talked to about the toilet flapper, right? I have to say that for the purpose of the people Okay, back to the story. So, not even between two firms with different strategies in the same industry can we use ratios to compare. Now let's talk about the second thing. A lot of times you can't apply this bigger or better mentality, bigger is better mentality to ratios. We said that liquidity ratios typically for people looking to loan us money, the higher, the better. But what about for us? Should we be sitting on mountains of liquidity at the firm? Absolutely not, because cash is a really poor investment. Our shareholders could do something else with that cash, so they're not going to want to pay us to sit on it, so we're not going to shoot for the moon on these liquidity ratios. And profit margin, you know, maybe I could get one idiot to buy a Ford Ranger for $500,000. And my profit margin would look great, but what would my sales look like? Right? Does that make sense? Okay, now we're on to the DuPont identity. So the DuPont identity is all about return on equity. And students often think that, hey, it's just another way to calculate return on equity. And that statement is true, but that's not everything that the DuPont identity does for us. So let's talk about why DuPont was so focused on the idea of equity, on return on equity. And it boils down to this: managers are clever. And they know that even with the same operations, the same assets, the same everything, they can boost ROE simply by taking on more debt and buying back shares. They can boost the ROE. And so if we are rewarding managers based purely on ROE, what will they do? They will simply boost the amount of debt in the capital structure. Now, that's going to boost the return on the equity, but it also boosts the risk. And so basically, you're just getting paid a higher return because you are taking on higher risk. The more money you owe, the riskier your business is. Does that make sense? My parents owe nothing to anybody and haven't since 1976. How risky is their situation? No risk. My wife and I owe less than $190,000. Which is pretty minor for people at our stage of life, right? What's the risk? And we make good money here at the university. What's the risk of us going under? Pretty minimal, right? I had a neighbor across the road. He was a spine surgeon, and he owned a brand new BMW M5. Anybody know? Mr. Fisher, is that a cheap car? No, it is not. So he had the brand new M5. The wife had a brand new Infiniti SUV because the BMW SUV was too small to carry around his brood of children. And so he's got his medical school debt, his student debt. He's bought this house, which is worth probably more than $100,000 more than mine because it has a finished walkout basement. And he's got this BMW M5. He is probably barely making his fixed payments every month. What does the riskiness of his situation look like versus me? Very risky. In fact, I would stand out on the driveway and he'd be looking bad. And I'd say, "What's up?" He'd say, "Mercy's not throwing me enough spines." Because he got paid by the spine. And so he was like, "Damn, why can't someone twist their back, right?" And so, well, he's not there anymore, so you guys, you can't go look him up and try to figure out who I'm talking about. My point to you is businesses are exactly the same. The more debt that you put on, the riskier the situation is, and of course, risk and reward have to go together. That's why that ROE goes up. And so the question is, how can we keep these crafty managers honest? How can we break this ROE into pieces that will allow us to properly measure managers' performance? First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about DuPont. DuPont, do any of you know what DuPont is or was?
Does it count?
Yeah, it's a big chemical plastics company, and for the longest time, they were like the thing. In fact, I've been in a DuPont factory, Parkersburg, West Virginia, making toothbrush bristles. You don't want to see that in order. By the way, always wash new toothbrushes before you use them. That's what I can tell you from my visit to that. It was a great plant, but the toothbrush strand is just going across the factory. People are walking by, coughing, whatever else. No, wash your toothbrush first. Okay, back to the story. DuPont is known for management excellence, and my example is a DuPont dynamite plant. You guys know what dynamite is? Okay, my dad worked in a dynamite plant in Carthage, Missouri from 1962 till I think around 2000 or so. And so that's how he paid our house off. That's where the money came from in our house. And dynamite plants are not all in one building. Why would you not put the entire dynamite factory under one roof?
So you don't lose it all in one go.
Yeah, so you don't lose it all in one go. Now, where my dad worked, and you guys can look on Google Earth and you can see it, they had what's called a powder line. It was a line of small buildings. But the DuPont factory looked like this. And of course, there were more than, however many buildings have been up here, 8. But that's what the DuPont dynamite factory looked like. So if one of these blows up, hopefully this stuff doesn't go over and catch the next one on fire. Now, DuPont had a lot of accidents, fatalities on the night shift. Why do you think that the night shift is more dangerous than the day shift? Fatigue? Okay, so people, I know you guys don't realize this yet, but you're not meant to be awake during the night, right? You're meant to be awake during the day and sleep during the night. So it's called circadian rhythm, and it gets all thrown off when you work the night shift. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, when you hire new people, where do they go first, the night shift or the day shift? Night shift. Oh yeah, nobody wants to work nights, so that's where the newbies go and hope for someone on day shift to retire or die so they can move to day shift. Okay, so that means our new people are on the night shift. They're tired, and let's talk about the day shift. They are fresh because they just got up and they're happy. And also, what do you think happened to any stupid people on the night shift before they ever made it to the day shift? They got fired or they got killed, right? And so the day shift is a whole lot safer. Now, what they noticed at DuPont was this was so true. The other thing is the entire management staff is there during the day. At night, what do you think? You think everybody's there? No. And so what DuPont said is, well, what we're going to do is we're going to build a really nice house right here in the middle of the compound, and we're going to have the plant manager and his family move into the house. Why do you think that would impact safety on the night shift?
It's bad to blow up your boss.
It's bad to blow up your boss. Okay, so you're assuming the employees care about blowing up the boss. That's sweet.
I feel like the plant manager would be more attentive.
Oh yeah! Okay, so if I'm laying in my bed at 2 a.m. and I smell smoke at the dynamite plant, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna get up and I'm gonna run out there and I'm gonna try to put an end to the situation before everything goes to, right? Does that make sense? Also, if it were just the manager by himself, maybe he wouldn't be so motivated. But who else have we moved into the house? His wife and his kids. By the way, gentlemen, if you get killed, your wife's going to be mad at you. But if you get those kids killed, there will be no end to your sorrow. So, what do you think happened? Do you think the plant manager started to care more about safety on the night shift? Absolutely. Could you get by with doing this today? No, why not? Do you think the government would let you get by with that? I mean, this is back in the day when we probably had little kids working in coal mines, right?
I feel like you also have to
What's
pay
that?
them a lot more too.
Oh, the plant manager?
Yeah.
Oh no, we're not going to pay him anymore. Why?
I mean now.
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe, but we're going to offer them a house, right? A nice house. She's such a skeptic. Okay, questions? Okay, so that just gives you a little idea of these crafty people at DuPont, what they're up to. Here's what the DuPont identity is. By the way, any formula that I put on a slide, do you think it should be on your note sheet for the exam? It's pretty obvious, but some people don't get that. So here is one you definitely want to have on there, and that is ROE is equal to, by the way, what do you think PM stands for? Profit margin, very good. And then TAT, what do you think that is? Total assets turnover. Total assets turnover. And then the last one is the equity multiplier. In fact, if you take profit margin times total asset turnover, you end up with net income over total assets, which is just ROA. So you can always calculate ROA if you have profit margin and total asset turnover. Now what happens when I throw all that stuff into a formula? I have expanded each one of those. Profit margin is net income divided by sales, and total asset turnover is sales divided by total assets. And then the last one is equity multiplier, total assets divided by total equity. If I go through there, notice that sales cancel out. Notice that total assets cancel out, leaving me with net income over total equity. So hopefully I've just proven to you that this DuPont identity does indeed give me ROE. Okay, now, why are we breaking it down into those three parts? And that's because each one of those parts actually means something. Profit margin, DuPont says that's a measure of operating efficiency. Remember, we said the way that we want to raise our profit margin isn't by decreasing sales. It's not by increasing the price of our goods. What did we say we wanted to do? Yeah, lower our costs. Get rid of these things. That's why profit margin is a measure of operating efficiency. And so what we want to do is watch that profit margin over time. It should be increasing. Now you say, wait a minute, I know how to fake this thing out. I can just raise the prices and they'll think that I'm very efficient. Except for one thing, what happens when you raise your prices? What happens to sales? Yeah, they drop. And so this total asset turnover would go down. And as a result, your asset use efficiency would go down. And so what we're going to tell managers that they've got to do is increase profit margin, increase total asset turnover while leaving equity multiplier alone. We have the capital structure that we want. You don't get to change that. So we want you to increase these other two things. By the way, I could lower prices and increase my total asset turnover by having greater sales then. What would that do, though, to my profit margin? It's going to go down. You can't cheat either of these measures and not hurt the other one. So that's the way that we need to set this thing up, is where the managers can't cheat. By the way, do you think managers would cheat if they had the opportunity?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because they're human, right? Okay, so that's the DuPont analysis. Any questions? So, I've got a couple of ways here to do ROE. I've got net income over total equity. I've also got equity multiplier. I've also got ROA times the equity multiplier, because these two things multiplied together give me ROA. Do you think this kind of information might be useful for you when trying to solve problems? Yeah, you're saying, wait a minute, I can't figure out ROE because he didn't give me net income and total equity. Ask yourself, what did he give me? And you may find yourself with some of this information. Questions? By the way, the equity multiplier, if you need it and don't have it, what should you be looking for? It's equal to 1 plus something. What was that something? Yeah, the debt to equity ratio. So this equity multiplier, if I haven't given that to you, what you want to be looking for is that debt to equity ratio. The A student can put all this kind of information together. The B student, maybe this information. The C student, maybe there. Questions? So let's talk about some problems with financial statement analysis. Number one, let's talk about conglomerates. What's it?
Hi.
Yeah. Okay. What's a conglomerate?
Company that owns several different kinds of businesses.
Yeah, so a company that has, let's call them divisions in different industries. Now, why would a conglomerate be a problem for financial ratio analysis? Remember we said you can only compare firms in the same industry. Well, what industry is a conglomerate in? And then students start to say, well, wait a minute, maybe what we can do is just come up with some sort of weighted average of the ratios for the different industries, and that would give us a good baseline for a conglomerate. If you are inside the conglomerate, maybe, but do you think businesses really give that kind of detailed reporting on a per unit? A lot of times we can't tell which divisions are making money and which aren't. For example, right now, if you look at Amazon's financial statements, they have basically three things. They've got the cloud thing, they've got the Amazon thing, or the e-commerce thing, and then they've got bricks and mortar. And the bricks and mortar includes Whole Foods and Amazon Fresh and Amazon Go, stuff like that. Can you tell how much of each one of those is in there? Absolutely not. And so only if you're inside the conglomerate might you be able to pull something like that off. So typically the answer is no. What if you have two similar conglomerates? My old employer, Halliburton, we were in a lot of lines of oil field service, and so was our competitor, Schlumberger. It looks like Schlumberger, but it's actually Schlumberger. And so far it sounds like you could compare us, except for one thing. You don't know what the proportions are. We were greater in some parts of the business and they were greater in others, so we can't necessarily do that. The other thing was this. We had an insurance company. Why? I have no idea. We had an insurance company, and Schlumberger also makes gas meters and gasoline pumps. In fact, if you're filling your tank, next time take a look. There's about a 25% chance that Schlumberger made the pay at the pump thing that you're using. They don't match up exactly. Therefore, we can't do ratio analysis comparison of one with another. And then there's seasonality. Seasonality, let's talk about inventory, for example. Let's take the candy business. What's a big candy holiday? Easter, very good.
There's like three.
Yeah, there is, but let's just assume.
Valentine's Day, Easter, and Halloween.
Oh, and then there's Christmas candy too. So yeah, but let's just assume, for sake of argument, let's just pick one of those. Let's say it's Valentine's Day, right? So what does that mean? It means if you're making candy for Valentine's Day, actually let's use Easter because they tend to have, it tends to be weird companies that do that. So let's talk about that. So you're getting ready to make candy for Easter. Easter is typically late March, early April. When do you start making the candy? Before that, right? And so let's say that Easter has just happened. What should your inventory look like at that firm?
Very low.
Yeah, it should be very low. On the other hand, the sales for that same time period are going to be really high because I just sold all that inventory. My inventory turns are going to look amazing. Now, 3 months later, what am I doing? I'm stocking up on sugar. I'm stocking up on cocoa. I'm not selling squat, right? And so my inventory turns are going to look bad, 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 bad. And my inventory is going to grow. My sales are going to still be zero, right? My inventory turn is going to look awful right up until Easter, right? When I sell all that stuff and I no longer have any inventory. And so that's what we call seasonality. I can't compare the ratios of this company one to another, right, from one season to the next. What I have to do is compare against the same quarter in the prior year if I'm going to make any comparisons whatsoever. So seasonality can affect these ratios too. And then we have different accounting methods between countries. In the United States, we use the generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. In most of the rest of the world, they use IFRS, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards. We are moving slowly toward IFRS in this country, but we're not quite there yet. Now, I'll give you an example of the differences between these. In the US, under GAAP, when we do research and development, we have to expense that in the same period. And so our net income goes down, our assets don't change. But what about under IFRS? Well, you can actually say that you're creating an asset for your research and development once you reach technical feasibility. Now, folks, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I can tell you that you don't know whether you've reached technical feasibility or not until the darn thing is actually in physical form and working, right? I don't know how they come up with this timing or definition of technical feasibility, but somehow they do. And at that point, instead of expensing that R&D, they're basically investing in an asset. And so their net income is going to be higher because they're not expensing it. Their total assets are also going to be higher. So there are all sorts of weird little things between those two that are going to cause problems. Now, what does that mean? Let's get back to my old employer, Halliburton. We were an American firm headquartered in Houston, Texas. What accounting do you think we used? Yeah, GAAP, good old-fashioned GAAP. Our competitor, Schlumberger, was a French company, and they were headquartered in the Dutch Antilles or some tax haven place. What do you think they were under? IFRS. Even if we were in exactly the same businesses in the exact same proportions, we still couldn't have compared our numbers to theirs because of the difference in these accounting standards. Then we have differences in currencies between countries. I mean, there's the obvious thing of in China, 7 units of their currency is equal to 1 of ours. And so their net profit's going to be 7 times higher for an identical company. So we can't, that's the simplest basis. But let's talk about what are the other ways that this comes in. You could actually be, let's talk about Procter & Gamble. Do you guys know what Procter & Gamble is? Consumer products company. They are around the world. They have operations basically everywhere. I've seen their products in Europe, I've seen them in Asia, pretty sure they're everywhere except for Antarctica. So back to the story. Procter & Gamble is a US company, and so their financial statements are reported in what currency? Dollars. And so anything that goes on overseas, in order for reporting purposes, they have to convert that back to dollars for their financial reporting. And due to currency fluctuations, I might be saying, whoa, wait a minute, these foreign operations are falling down on the job. But it could just be as a result of the exchange rate. For example, right now the American dollar is stronger than it has been since 1985. And so these foreign operations that were reporting, let's say they were reporting $1 million in profit previously, now they're only reporting 900,000. Are they doing anything wrong? No, they're doing the same thing they've always done. It's just the shift in the currency exchange rate that's causing this problem. So that's another thing that can give us trouble. And then finally, we have differences in accounting for inventory. We have LIFO and FIFO. What do you think those things stand for?
Last in, first out.
Yeah, last in, first out, first in, first out. And so when we do this, are we actually talking about taking physically the last one on the shelf and selling it first? No. Physically, assume all these parts are identical. What we're taking is the cost of the last one I put on the shelf and counting that as the cost of the next one I sell. Now, why might that be helpful? Well, during inflationary times, which by the way, do we have inflationary times? Oh yeah. During inflationary times, that means we're going to be subtracting a greater cost because that last one in will be the most expensive. Now, that will make my gross profit look less, which will make my taxable income less. What will that do for me? What's it going to do to my taxes? Yeah, it's going to reduce them. Now, so far, this choice of which one to count as the cost of the thing that I sold has had no financial impact whatsoever. But now we're talking a real impact. Our taxes paid with real money. Yeah, and so if we can reduce those taxes, we've actually made our situation better, even though accounting for such things in LIFO make my net income look smaller because they've got that inflated cost. Now, of course, there's a problem when I do last in, first out. Those things that are left on the shelf are valued at old, stale prices. And so my inventory on the shelf is minimized compared to what it really looks like. And my cost of goods sold is maximized compared to what it really looks like. So if we have cost of goods sold that is inflated and inventory that is deflated, that's going to make my inventory turns look higher. And so it will look like I'm performing better, but am I in reality? Not really. Now let's look at FIFO. What's FIFO going to do? It's going to make your cost of goods sold lower because you're using the oldest, cheapest price. And it's going to make your taxes higher, but it's going to also leave that inventory on the shelf being valued more highly. And so the inventory turns are going to look lower at a firm that uses FIFO. So, which one should you be doing? What do we care about in finance? We care about cash flows. During inflationary times, which one of these leads to the greatest cash flow? LIFO, right? LIFO leads to the greatest cash flow because it reduces your taxes. And when I first went to work for Halliburton, 1994, they had just the year before switched from FIFO accounting to LIFO. And it was amazing what it did for our tax bill. And by the way, perfectly legal. Perfectly legal. Under United States law, it's perfectly legal to use either one of these. Now, by the way, Obama tried to get rid of LIFO. Any idea why?
He wants more tax money.
He wants more tax money. Why should we let the shareholders have that money? I can do something nicer with it, right? Politicians always think that.
Typical government.
Yeah, typical government perspective, right? Okay, so that's why we see differences in our ratios as a result of LIFO and FIFO. Now, can we make adjustments to convert IFRS to GAAP? Yes. In fact, Dr. Jones, my department head, teaches a course that tells you basically how to do that. Can you make adjustments for FIFO versus LIFO? Yes, I've done it before. It's hugely painful. They have what's called a LIFO reserve or a FIFO reserve, and there's all this machinations that goes on. You can do it, but these are things that you need to watch out for when you're doing this kind of work to avoid making mistakes.